Welcome to the second annual conference hosted by the EXA Consulting Group entitled Agile Procurement and Cyberspace, Critical Insights for Canadian Industry, Defense, and National Security Agencies. My name is Goran Samuel Pesic. I'm the President and CEO of Samuel Associates, a strategic consultancy providing market advisory services and government relations advice to leaders and organizations working in aerospace, defense, and cyber industries in Canada and worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure today to be organizing this important and timely event on behalf of the EXA Consulting Group. Above the event format, the conference consists of two parts. During the first part, two distinguished American speakers will discuss the evolution of the U.S. federal government procurement system in the cyber era. This will be followed by a presentation from the Innovation and Agile Procurement Directorate, Public Services and Procurement Canada. They will speak on the state of Agile procurement in Canada. The forum will close by an interactive question and answer session. The second part features 5 panelists who will each have 10 minutes each to provide their perspectives on Agile procurement and cyberspace. Today's event provides experts from the Government of Canada, including Shared Services Canada and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We're also fortunate to have the Executive Director of the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, representing the cyber not-for-profit sector, and a Senior Executive from Bell Canada, representing the telecommunications industry. After the presentations, there will be a question and answer session. Today's host and event moderator is Alex McPhail, President and CEO of the EXA Consulting Group. Alex McPhail is a Canadian leader in complex RFPs, capture campaigns, and proposals. In his 35-year career, Alex has led complex government procurements and major industry pursuits in defense, cyber, aerospace, health, finance, and infrastructure. He is respected as Canada's foremost bid managers, a decisive executive, and a thought leader. Alex holds a Bachelor of Science from the University of Waterloo and taught at the Master of Public Administration degree program at Carleton University. He's also taught strategic management at the Sloan School of Business. Alex is a recognized public speaker and lecturer in business leadership and Canadian procurement and government contracting processes. The EXA Consulting Group is Canada's leading firm in complex RFPs, campaign management, and proposals. EXA specializes in complex pursuits over $100 million, and over the past 15 years, EXA has helped clients win more than $8 billion in government contracts. EXA has served clients in Canada, the United States, Europe, and Asia. Today's event is one of many programs sponsored by EXA as part of its industry awareness and engagement programs. I encourage you to visit the EXA Consulting Group online to explore EXA's other digital workshops, informative blogs, and more recently, podcasts featuring some of Canada's top leaders and influencers in the defense, aerospace, cybersecurity, and security industries. I now invite Alex McPhail, President of the EXA Consulting Group, to begin the conference. Alex.
Thank you, Goran, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining the second annual EXA Group Cyber Procurement Session. We're building on the success of last year's program, which was looking at cybersecurity procurement. Today, we're discussing agile procurement in the age of cyber. I'm really pleased and I feel privileged that we have such a strong and wide-reaching attendance this year. We have over 90 people. We have people from obviously Canada, USA, Spain, Serbia, Sweden, the Netherlands, and probably some others that I haven't seen yet. So something like this doesn't come together very easily. It takes a lot of work. So if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd just like to thank some of the people who were part of making this happen. I'd like to thank Simon Page, Assistant Deputy Minister of Defense and Marine Procurement at PSPC. I'd also like to thank Eric Germain and Sylvain Cyr, also Director Generals at PSPC. Greg Hills, Director General of Shared Services Canada, and Jason Weatherby, Senior Director, Shared Services Canada. Of course, I'd I'd like to, excuse me, I'm just going to press a button here. I'd like to thank Goran Pesic and his team at Samuel Associates. They've been doing the heavy lifting on this, and so it's been a really big effort to bring this together, and I'm very pleased that it's going as well as it is. So, with those important thanks, I'd like to open the session. And I'd like to start with just a very high level overview of what Agile procurement is and isn't. If you take a look at the slide in front of you, on the left side, we're showing traditional procurement. And in traditional procurement, we lock the design and the solution in very early. The specification tends to be pretty complex. And that's in part because we don't actually expect the parties to talk to each other. So when you have a bidder, especially at the bidding stage, they don't really have the opportunity to talk to the client. They go through an intermediary. And as a result, the specification really has to be robust and very firm. And so there have been studies that have shown that in complex major procurements, especially in the defense area, it can take up to 10 years from the moment that a capability deficiency is identified to the moment that contract award takes place. So that's a long time in order to get from initial concept to contract award. And as a result, sometimes obsolescence creeps in at the earliest stages. So on the right side of this slide, we're just showing by contrast how Agile procurement works. It's an iterative process, and it refines the design on each iteration. So at the first cycle, you want to develop the absolute minimum acceptable solution to the client, and then every cycle after that is improving and enhancing that solution. And in each cycle, the client and the contractor collaborate to define the requirements for the next cycle. So one of the important things about this approach is that it addresses obsolescence at each cycle. So as issues become close to becoming obsolete, you can handle them in the short term of the cycle rather than in the long term of the entire project. So it's a tightly integrated collaborative framework. And it's important that both the client and the contractor work hand in hand in a program like this. It's really more than a systems engineering approach, and I'll discuss that in the next slide. So in the era of cyber, we have threat vectors that we have to worry about. And I've shown them here juxtaposed against the procurement process. So we can have a malware that can modify itself these days. And so it changes as it goes from host to host. We can also see how things can rapidly adapt and be created in a matter of hours or days. So the threat vector obsolescence is measured in days, sometimes as short as hours. So that's an issue that we have to be aware of, and we can address most of those through a database of threat vectors and make sure that we update that database on a regular basis. I'm going to skip over security obsolescence in a moment and talk about technology obsolescence. So that's as things just become technologically obsolete. And part of the problem is when you run a traditional procurement, by the time that program comes to life, you may have outlived some of the technology obsolescence issues. And so as you go into in-service support, one of the first things that you have to do is address some of the technology obsolescence issues. And so if you could compress that approach a little bit, then you would be able to deal with those obsolescence issues before you get to in-service support. I want to jump back now to the security obsolescence, and that happens when a threat changes to such a point that you can't just deal with it in an upgrade to a database. And so for an example of that is if the supply chain itself to your malware protection system is attacked, the malware protection system might not be aware of that, and so it can't defend against that threat vector. And so you need a completely new malware defense system. And so that's a case where you have an obsolescence that can't be treated with a simple change to the database. And so when that happens, if you have technology, if you have COTS, if you have a software, a product, it doesn't matter. That product needs to be swapped out and it needs to be upgraded in order to protect the whole system. And as soon as, if you have a COTS system that are talking to each other, as soon as you swap one of those components out, you may discover that its interoperability with the other components in a COTS system it starts to become a problem, and then you have to swap out other ones. And so you can see how maintaining a COTS product system can become a problem, especially with security obsolescence. So that's one of the reasons why we need to look at, is there a better way of doing this procurement so that you can deal with obsolescence before you get into in-service support. So this next slide, I've really packed a lot into this, and I'm not going to go through the details of this, but there's sort of an overall point here. And that is that Agile is not just about systems engineering. It reflects a different set of values, priorities, methods, behaviors, and relationships. It's a different culture. So Agile changes the way the entire enterprise works, and it changes the way that a client would deal with a contractor. So it changes both sides of that equation. And so implementing Agile can be disruptive. So it's not something that you can deal with easily. You don't simply say, hey, let's do Agile and start moving from there. There's a tremendous amount of input, and sometimes it can take 12 to 15 weeks after you've firmly implemented it just to get your first quick win. So there's a lot of work that has to go into addressing Agile. And as a result, it's not a simple subject, and it's not something we should treat lightly. So last slide that I want to offer in terms of this introduction is understanding that everyone brings a unique perspective to Agile. Each person is going to look at these questions in front of you here and have a different application and a different approach to those questions, because each person comes to this forum with different circumstances. And so the goal of today is to start asking these questions and discussing these questions in a way that really helps us move forward through a very complex and in some cases filled with a few landmines in terms of getting from here to there when you look at how do we address some of those issues associated with obsolescence, and is Agile procurement the best way to go all the time. And so to me, a win today is when people walk away knowing how to ask these questions in a more meaningful way. I don't presume that, in fact, we're going to have the answers today. It's too complex and there's too much to consider to actually suggest that we can answer these questions in a meaningful way, but we can have a dialogue. And that's what I'm hoping that today is going to be all about. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first two speakers. They're from the USA, and John Scott from Washington, D.C. is president of the ION Channel, which is a software supply chain as a service organization. He's also president of the Selection Pressure LLC, which does research in software supply chain management. He's a fellow in New America's Security Initiative, founder of the Open Source for America, founder of the CODIS Foundation, and he's on the editorial board of the Department of Defense Software Tech News magazine. So welcome, John. Also, Eric Lofgren, also from Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow at the George Mason University, and he's involved with the Center for Government Contracting. He's a cost proposal consultant for government contracts. He's a writer, podcaster, and defense procurement historian. And Eric is the founder and operator of Acquisition Talk. That's a blog on current events related to USA weapons systems procurement, with a global ranking of the top 10% among all blogs. So John and Eric, they're going to discuss the current state of agile procurement in the USA. So welcome, John and Eric. I'm delighted that you could join us.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks,
so,
Alex.
Yeah, I'll kick it off a little bit, and I kind of want to, again, you said, a history expert. I don't know about expert, but I will give a little bit of historical perspective as to how did we get to where we were, because, Alex was talking about, how we need to move to agile processes and away from these, large fixed specifications. And that's actually how the United States Department of Defense actually used to run before the 1960s, right? We had kind of like a bureau and arsenal system where a great deal of flexibility is actually provided to folks in the military to make their own decisions incrementally on weapon systems programs. So there was no control from the top for the most part. And what was really being seen at that time was the need to remove duplication and the need to go for a single best solution. And so one of the major events that kind of precipitated this was kind of what was called the Revolt of the Admirals at the end of the 40s, where they wanted a supercarrier to kind of launch the nuclear retaliation mission. The Air Force had its own B-36 Peacekeeper. They seemed unaffordable, but there was no real way of controlling, which one the services went towards, right? And husband the resources. So there was a long process over the 50s where they were trying to push in a lot of these, what we now call waterfall systems. And that's what the systems that were developed in the 60s are exactly what we have today in the United States Department of Defense. And I would say that these are kind of based on two kind of similar ideals. One is Taylorism, which of course started in the early 20th century, but it was really designed for mass production of hardware. So where you had routine labor, raw materials, physical capital, and 90 or more % of the total cost was really in reproduction and sustainment, these routine processes, rather than the knowledge work, right, that we're seeing with software. So it was a very different kind of paradigm of development that was grown up under Taylorism. And systems analysis, which was started in the 1950s, was actually there to try to tackle some of the engineering problems. So what were those assumptions? First, if you knew the laws of nature and the rules of engineering and mathematics, you can design the optimal solution for any set of requirements. That was just a belief at the time. And it was a very idealistic belief, and there wasn't exactly data to say that that was wrong or right at the time. But now that we can look back, we can see that uncertainty is too great, right? So actually in the 1948, the very first RAND systems analysis study said the next Air Force bomber should use turboprop rather than turbojet engines. That analysis was a complete mistake, right? Because the B-52 was actually the thing that came out of that. The Air Force rejected the systems analysis study and went with what we have now as the B-52. And the B-52 is interesting because not only is it still operating today, it was designed in the late 40s, and it went through many cycles of iteration, not just in the design phase, but in the production phase. Every year they're putting out a new model up to the B-52H. And these things increased their performance dramatically in terms of range, in terms of payload capacity, and so forth. And it was really a prototype, the B-47, that allowed them that gave them the data to know that a turbojet was much better than a turboprop. So where the systems analysis really kind of came into the Department of Defense was the 1960s with program budgeting. So rather than providing these bureaus and arsenals, pretty flexible money so that they can go after systems in the year of execution and then pivot when they need to, start and stop things in a very agile manner, the program budget says we need to focus on outputs, right? A weapon system like a B-52, for example. But we need to have analysis years ahead of program initiation, cost that out to completion, and then continually measure back to that baseline using a life cycle cost estimate. So it was very, very heavily dependent on prediction of the total system rather than incremental development and lean methodology that we're seeing in the modern time. So I'd just like to kind of talk to you a little bit about what the force structure looks like today in the Department of Defense. And almost most of that force structure is really done outside the formal system of systems analysis and program budgeting, which is the formal system. So I'll just give you a couple instances, and then we can move to John. Before the 1960s, like major weapon systems that we still use today, ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, nuclear aircraft carriers, laser guided bombs, jet aircraft, radar. This is all predating the 1960s kind of methodology, the waterfall methodology that we use today. And even since the 1960s, most of the transformative things that the Department of Defense has did not go through that system. UAVs, the Predator, that was actually done outside the system and provided basically off the shelf by General Atomics. Night vision goggles, the internet, GPS, lasers, stealth, right? Stealth aircraft was an interesting one, the F-117. There was no requirement for the F-117. It was built by Lockheed Skunk Works, and they didn't try to revolutionize with one big bang system, right? That we see with like the F-35 or the F-22. They use high maturity components. For example, the engine from the T-38, flight controls from the F-16, landing gears from the A-10, environmental systems from the C-130. They were really just trying to not boil the ocean, but do a minimal viable product of what the airframe needs to be with high maturity components everywhere else, and then iterate from that. And so what the formal process that we have today, 1 to 3 years of requirements, 3 to 5 years to get funds appropriated through the PBBE process, right? And then you go into execution, you have a baseline, and it's very hard to change those requirements and iterate from there, because you don't want to have to open up these processes of requirements and budget again, which can take many more years, right? And so just one example of, it's not just that the threat is moving fast, but also commercial technology is now moving fast and eclipsing Department of Defense's spend. So we have to be able to integrate commercial technology quickly. And one example here with the Virginia class is it was started in 1991. It entered the detailed design and construction in 1997, right? And they were going to pay, about $40,000 for a control panel to operate the periscopes. Now, the Xbox controller was released in 2001. That's $20 for an Xbox controller. It wasn't until 2017 that they integrated an Xbox controller and got rid of a $40,000 control panel. So, that's 16 years of lag where they're paying like 3 orders of magnitude cost higher just for this one commercial system that could have been integrated. And there's these opportunities all over the place, of course. And the Department of Defense is struggling to get cloud, right, with the JEDI contract. So this is kind of like the imperative of the Department of Defense used to do things in an agile way. It turned into a waterfall process. Most of the things that actually succeed don't go through that waterfall process. And now there's an imperative as industry itself, right, has been moving towards agile processes in the tech sector, but also in the major industrial sector. They're picking up in the last 10 years. There's an imperative for the Department of Defense to go that way. And we can talk about where they've been successful or not. So I'll bring it over to John for talking about where we need to go.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Alex, for that great introduction. I'm really happy to be here this morning. So I think, as Eric has said, I think that the issue that we're running into now is, I think, and this is not hard to see, is just that the speed and the scale of the threats have greatly increased. I think you only have to look at something like the pipeline attack that's happened this last week that's kind of causing semi-havoc on the East Coast. They're freaking out, but we're just not able to keep up with the threats that are going on right now. Especially with the development timelines. And so this is kind of into some of the discussions, is that, the technology cycle is now inside of our acquisition cycle. So, what that really means is that, our ability to actually build solutions and have them actually out there functioning, impacting the world, meeting mission needs, doing things like that in the military or even the civilian market, is greatly limited now by our ability to actually buy and build them. Because especially for the military, most things do not work right out of the box. There is some modification, some analysis, some adjudication has to go to see if that technology can actually work or integrate with the rest of the systems that are out there. So there's always going to be some time for that. But the problem that we've run into now is that just the integration and the development of these technologies just can't keep up with the way the commercial sector is going. I mean, up until maybe about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the military used to be the driving force behind a lot of high tech work that was going on in the private sector. That no longer is the case outside of very specialized things. But more and more, it's just how do you adopt commercial technologies, bring them in, and really quickly turn around to have impact in the fight or into the mission. Because the threats are evolving. As Eric said, having this long timeline to try and meet the amount of threats that are coming just isn't working for us. Especially the whole focus, and also as everything goes much more towards software, hardware systems that are out there. The volume of software that also is sort of killing a lot of acquisitions people. Just the existing processes that we use have to change. But the good news is I think we've done this before. If you look at how Agile actually works, if you go back to the old Lockheed in the 1950s, how systems were actually built. Now, obviously, the timeline's a little bit different, but we actually sort of knew how to do this before a lot of bureaucracy got in the way. The process with the way modern companies actually go out and build software is build a little bit, course correct, get feedback, figure out how things are working. So that you actually do have opportunities. And I think this is the most important thing: is have opportunities for to have options to insert new technologies, new ideas, new ways of integration into what you're trying to build. I think the gas pipelines is just a great example. I mean, a lot of that is really just also goes to the technical debt that we've built up over a number of years by sort of ignoring a lot of work that's there. So I think we really have to kind of reprioritize what we really want to get out of these systems. Try and get something built earlier on. That doesn't mean like in typical parlance, is sort of the big bang acquisition of like, we're going to go spend a ton of money, get that out there really quickly, and then, see what's going on. And so, there's been some really great work that's gone on in the military, in the US military, about how do you get out of our own way. That's probably the best way of putting it. I'll say just one thing before we get into the kind of the case study that we were talking about is, I think one of the biggest things is also culture. I think that in the military, we're trying to get away from this, looking at the contractors as being the adversary, that the contractors are always trying to take advantage of everybody kind of going forward. I think you have to look at this as it really is a cultural shift. And so I think with that kind of, I guess we'll go into our case study with Kessel Run. So Kessel Run, just to give a little introduction, is a military command out of Hanscom Air Force Base, or a military group out of Hanscom Air Force Base. That's basically working on how do you develop and deploy using new technologies, new mission threats. And so they've been able to kind of meet a number of different cases going forward. But I think the biggest thing that they had was kind of this culture. They had smart, motivated airmen with top cover. So they had people who were willing to give them some leeway, go out and do some experimentation. They were able to kind of pick some of their own staff, some of the contractors as well. And they were able to kind of go out and do some building, but really have the person who had the problem sitting almost directly right next to the developer who could help solve the problem. This is the way of sort of starting small. So you can actually start to go out and actually meet the demand and actually know what it is, because otherwise the traditional method would be interview the airmen, interview the airmen, take about a year to kind of do all the interviews, figure out the design, and then give that design document to a contractor. By that point, the mission threat may have changed, other things like that. I think, Eric, over to you about the process side.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main points. That first, like the way that Department of Defense now works is that you assume that the user or a representative of the user in the requirements office kind of can define what they need, and then they just hand it off to the acquisition folks, and the acquisition folks go execute, but they don't really have responsibility for it, right? They outsource the whole thing to the contractors, and they want to hold the contractors to those requirements. So that's where we get the adversarial nature. But the acquisition folks actually rotate in and out fairly quickly. And then maybe many years later, you deliver something to the user. And is it the same thing that the user needed when you started? Maybe, maybe not. But Kessel Run is interesting because it really was another irregular program, right? It started out of this thing, Air Operations Center. They were delivering software basically in like 2 to 3 year timelines, and it just was not working. They were not getting the capability they needed. And Senator McCain kind of came in and he was like, we're just going to shut this whole thing down. And there were some innovative airmen that said, hey, well, a lot of this stuff is just pretty basic, software development that anyone can really do. It's not like we're trying to, create new things here. We're just trying to use existing technologies to solve problems in very kind of traditional manners. And so they actually used that wedge that already existed in the budget rather than having to line up new requirements, wait multiple years in order to find a wedge and then get started. They used that wedge of the canceled program to actually get started quickly. And they didn't have requirements at first. It was all user-centered design. They would actually, the program official actually never had gone to the Air Operations Center itself in the previous way of doing things. And now Kessel Run comes in and they kind of don't have any requirements at all. They do it very differently. They just do user-centered design. They sit with the users. They say, what are your pain points? They sketch out something, they deliver it quickly, and then they kind of start iterating from there. And what's happened over the past couple of years is the formalization of that process where the budget is still kind of coming in from multiple places, and that's a challenge. But at least for the requirements, they now have high level, like 1-sentence statements of outcomes. They don't say, I need this system to talk to this system to have these specific outputs. They just say user needs, this general class of data to do targeting, for example. And then they connect user stories to that, and they don't let that slow them down. And so that's how they have this really high and fast velocity of deployment. But I think one of the central parts of Kessel Run is also that they're moving back to an older style where they have, in-house development talent. It's not just a bunch of acquisition folks outsourcing contracts. They actually have airmen coders. And also they have another company come in and help them with their development process. And then they also, use contractors to a great extent. But Kessel Run owns that technical baseline in terms of the ability to develop and to deploy and be responsible to the users for performance.
Yeah, and I think I'd also add that what's also really interesting is that they didn't throw a huge amount of money at them. I think that this is the other key thing. Traditional acquisitions is like, all right, we're going to have a $500 million acquisition. We're going to put it out. We're going to throw a ton of money around, and maybe a year from now we'll have something out and running. I think that starting small, trying to solve actual problems, figuring out how to kind of what are the smaller things, the quick wins you can get in MVP design. And kind of work towards that way, and also making sure that sort of everyone in the program shop has some skin in the game in terms of making sure that something's going to work. I think that's the responsibility of system design and delivery sort of has to be shared across the entire organization. It can't just be like, well, contract's done. It's all on the contractor now. We'll just have our meetings every month and yell at them. It really has to be you've got people who are actively engaged and sort of breaking down some of the walls between the contractors and the users. And so I think that the outcomes have been really pretty remarkable in terms of what they've been built. I mean, not remarkable for what if you go out in the private sector, what they're able to do, but actually in the military, being able to kind of deliver some of these programs within 3-6 months, actually getting people to use it out in the field and sort of go like, this is exactly what I wanted. We've been asking for 10 years. Why? Thank you. People like, the discussion points of people just sort of saying we really need to get towards that. But I think that some of the big, the big things was that they had top cover. But also what the great thing about Agile and doing it really fast is doing fast development is you can fail faster and fail in smaller areas. And I think that's one thing that you have to have top cover, and you have to have some explanation around. And some that this is going to happen. You might waste a month of development time figuring out that, well, that design that we thought we were going to go down just doesn't work. And I think sort of being upfront about that, but it's better to have wasted, say, 500 man hours than it is to waste 10,000 man hours or $1 million or $1 billion on a program before you figure out, like, well, we chose the wrong framework. And so I think that's the other bigger thing, is that you're going to fail on small things. That's fine, because failure basically informs your decisions for the next design going down the route. And so I think that's the other side of the coin. But failing with smaller amounts of money or less time is a much better way of going through that. And then also really focusing on what the user wants. And having that tight feedback loop of, like, yes, no, should the button go here? And obviously we're talking more about cloud center design, application level stuff. But I'm seeing on the other programs, people taking the same approach towards small size, weight, and power type systems that actually are deployed, that you traditionally would think of with the military and sensor stuff like that too. So that's sort of what's going on. Eric? Contract?
Yeah, well, I'll just give a quick example. So they had a tanker planning app called Jigsaw. Literally, people would be putting like little icons on like a whiteboard and moving them physically around. And they were just like, well, we could just digitize this, right, pretty quickly. And they were able to actually not only save airmen time, but they would actually save about $300 million a year in fuel costs, just because they're not having to replan and send things out inefficiently. So they have a number of different applications that they've been putting out. And that's one of the things that that was interesting for them. They don't just have these requirements and then they just go after the whole thing and put like this big thing on solicitation, take 2 years to go solicit that thing. And then, the contractor goes executes. They actually, of the requirements, they just say, what are the top couple ones that we need to do now? And then they socialize that with stakeholders. And then they go execute that over 6 months. And then they say, what's the next things that we need to go with? And they keep those channels open with the users, with testers, with the requirements officers, with those in the command levels and joint interests. So they can continually keep talking. And one of the things that's interesting about Kessel Run, well, again, I would actually just say that I agree with John in terms of starting small, because what we've seen on defense programs is we actually ramp up very quickly, and we expect them because of the tight timelines, actually, right? Because we say, okay, we do all this planning, and now you have 5 years to get something out, right? So so we basically compress those timelines because we had all this planning and contracting going on. And so we give them too much money. They actually, most programs under execute in the first years and then way over execute later on. So we've been pushing too much money on them too fast. But I'll just kind of go to how do they do contracting? And then how does that kind of differ from a traditional program office, right? So in Kessel Run, because they have airman coders and because they're responsible for this thing, they usually use time and material. So they're basically just buying labor hours of certain types of talent areas, right? So I need cloud engineers, right? So I'll go after a set of cloud engineers and bring them on board, or a certain type of application engineer data. They'll bring those types of people on board as T&M, and they'll basically be development services, and they own the intellectual property literally to everything, right? And so that has its benefits and drawbacks, right? The government is able to determine exactly what's happening on that system, and they're never going to be vendor locked into anything, right? But then, what types of companies are those that are going to be wanting to play with you in that kind of space when, you're not building any intellectual capital yourself. You're more of selling butts and seats to a degree. Now, a traditional program office where you really are just mainly interfacing with contractors, what does that look like? You're probably not going to be doing T&M contracts in the same way that this software factory would. But you also probably don't want to be listing, 100 pages of specifications, go over a 2-year time frame, and then just give them a total responsibility contract. And so there's a number of ways that in the Department of Defense that, they've been looking at different contract vehicles or mechanisms to go after that, and we can get into a little bit about it, but most of it is they do try to modularize the contracts, even for a lot of regular program offices. And the way that they do this is you separate a lot of the technical direction from the contract. And you say the contract just has period of performance and price, basic things of security, ability to deliver code. And then we just have regular meetings and reviews, and this modular and short period of performance that allows the government to kind of see what's happening and hold them accountable on the next task order. So you have 4 options and you can quickly execute those if the contractor is performing, or offboard those guys and on-ramp others onto a kind of modular contract structure. We call them indefinite quantity or IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts. And so we've seen a big growth in this area of type of contracting.
Yeah, and I think that I think some of the takeaways are, it will definitely, going Agile will definitely involve, a lot more coordination with on the government side from, are you getting what you want out of the people who are working on your program? And with the contracting officers say, thumbs up, thumbs down, things are going well, we've got the wrong people. It definitely is less of I think the old way was sort of a fire and forget, and wait for the contractor to go back to their home shop and be kind of run everything there. And I think that's the thing, but this is a good thing. I mean, being actually involved with how the software is being developed, how it's going forward. I mean, that's just something that's going to have to, you're going to have to do with Agile. There's no way, I think, of getting away from actually being involved. And that means, being involved with, code review, looking at code commits, sort of being involved with how they're actually building the software, where the build, the CI/CD or DevOps pipeline might be. And that involves, and also bringing in the government security people to overview that. And so I think that the government's going to have to be, as a buyer, is going to have to be much more involved with this. And especially as these systems are out there and they're going to go forward, the maintenance tail is also a little bit different. I mean, traditional systems, from a hardware perspective, there's lots of spending up the front end, and then there's a tail for maintenance. I mean, software development and operations and maintenance is much more of a flat line. You might spend a little bit more at the front end in terms of to get what you want, and then there's maintenance, but the maintenance is going to always kind of be there as an upgrade and new features and things like that. And so I think that, maybe to close it out, and I guess go to questions, is that, we're all becoming software development shops, whether we like it or not. And I think the folks that sort of just realize, this is going to have to become a competency. We're going to have to hire people who know how to program to some level, maybe not experts, but they at least know how to work their way around. And know the nomenclature and know the verbiage and things like that. And so I think that, we just have to understand that that's the way that if software delivering any value, if software helps you deliver any of your value to your end customers, whether it's a Medicaid recipient or anything like that in the U.S., you're a software shop now. So that means you're going to have to adopt a lot of the ways of thinking about software. And Agile seems to be the best way so far of doing it. Over.
Yeah, so we're definitely taking questions. So please enter in the questions into the chat function, and be happy to kind of address those. But going back to what John was saying, one of my mental models is that in the traditional framework of how to do development, right? You list the specifications that get you the optimal output of what it is you want to build. And then you work your way back to what does it cost to get there? And what is this correct schedule to get there, right? And then we basically flip that in the Agile era, where you say, give me basically a level of effort of resources and give me a defined chunk of time, and let me get the most important requirements out of there. And then I'll iterate through that. And so it kind of moves you from this life cycle cost estimation based on historicals toward something more like, I just need a certain number of development teams, right? And then, you kind of fund to that level, and then you incrementally decide, do I need to ramp up or ramp down? You don't know everything that you're not trying to predict everything up front. And this is kind of a paradigm shift, especially for cost estimators and oversight officials, because what we've seen on a lot of these programs is that despite the fact that the program is supposed to be agile, supposed to be doing user-centered design and iterate through development and operations and then back into development with new paths, oversight doesn't like that. They want a strict baseline before you start so that they can measure back to that in terms of cost growth and schedule growth. And that is their version of oversight. The problem is, was the prediction actually what is needed, right? If I could predict exactly what I need, and that is the ground truth of value, then that kind of waterfall process and measure back to baseline in terms of financial data makes a lot of sense. But if I'm saying, look, my cycle times, like, I don't know what industry is going to be providing. I need to be able to ingest that. I don't know what's changing with the threat. I don't know necessarily whether this technology will pan out or not. Then it's actually very harmful. And so you see a lot of these programs that come out, like I'll just like name like an F-35, right? It's been being developed over more than a 20-year time span. It started in 1994, right? But since it's the only one that we're building, we can't really say whether it was valuable or not, right? Because we have no alternatives to compare it against. And even if it hit its baseline, is that valuable? Yes or no? No one can really understand this question of value, whether it's valuable or not. We can count how many things we've put out. We can count things like that, but we still have a hard problem getting back to value. And that's one of the things I think Agile enterprises do fairly well in terms of their communication of what is valuable, why we start and stop, and kind of, communicating that up the chain in kind of like a fractal way rather than through just like financial data reporting. I don't know if you had anything on, on that, John.
I completely agree. I think that just that there's always an old adage that the enemy gets a vote as well, and so I think especially when you start looking at cyberspace and cybersecurity, I mean the good thing about it's not really good, but having attackers probing your systems, looking for weaknesses, trying to find stuff, that actually does make you better over time if you're able to really rapidly take that as positive feedback and then change your systems. So if somebody gets into their system some way and you can find out where that vulnerability was. And so if you can kind of really use that as sort of almost a testing function to figure out how to go through from a cyberspace. I mean, and that's what you see with good companies doing like Netflix and Amazon. Using that as positive feedback to kind of build better going forward. And I think it's really about, I think that's what really Agile gets towards, is having tight feedback loops to be able to kind of modify and update your systems going forward to meet whatever mission goals you might need. But it does definitely take a different view of measuring and metrics. Kind of going forward.
Yeah, the test enterprise is interesting in DoD because you're supposed to create a test evaluation master plan up front. And this defines exact things that you're going to like test later on, many years in the future, right? And I just recently the DoD was talking about its white hat hacker program. Apparently 70,000 bugs have been found and validated through this process. And many times, like, the white hat hackers will get into a system within like a minute, right? And they'll get complete admin access. So like obfuscation of this code really didn't work in terms of security, but it's also the test and evaluation process that needs updating for this world where, the white hat hackers, like, one of the problems is if the developer is trying to say up front exactly what the vulnerabilities you need to be testing are, well, how do they know, right? Don't you want an innovating person with a different point of view, with different tools and processes to be attacking that? Because that's exactly how the Chinese are going to be attacking it, right? They're not going to be attacking it based on, okay, here's your list of requirements. I'm just going to, attack you in the way that you said that you've already closed those holes. So that's one of the issues with test and evaluation is how do you have a test organization that is able to test robustly, but not necessarily have to do the things that were stated many years up front. And again, it's that waterfall process.
Yeah, I think that the testing has to be much more collaborative kind of going forward. Are there any questions?
It's Alex. So there are a few questions lined up here. I don't know if we're going to have time for all of them. But one of them is if someone is looking to get into Agile programs, you talked about quick wins, starting with a program that was kind of orphaned and then you went from there. Yeah. What are some of the parameters or some of the characteristics that a manager should look at in considering a candidate for an early Agile program?
So I think traditional Agile, you think of it as you could feed them with 2 pizzas. So, I mean, something that you can look at and sort of estimate out that say, all right, we're going to need, and usually that's about maybe, 6 to 8 people for a 2 pizza team. And so I think that, managers should have a feel for what features and functions in the capability that they're building that maybe hasn't seen enough love over the last couple of years or whatever. What can that team roughly build out. And so I think that's the first thing, is looking at something that, you could, and some of this is going to require, discussion with the developers of like, all right, if I gave you 3 months, could you revamp this one small part of the system? And that might be a simple thing, like, and what I typically see is folks going after things like, multi-factor authentication or identity, things that are sort of, maybe, features that need to be used by everybody, but they're very well contained in terms of what they should do. So I think from an estimation point of view, that's sort of what I've seen from a simple thing. I mean, Eric?
Yeah, I would, in terms of, I don't think you should just be like going around and saying like, oh, let me go look for an Agile thing to go do, right? I think a lot of times these are pretty organic, and they have to be focused on the user and what their journey is. So that's one of the big differences with Agile organizations, right? It's like we tend to be based on a systems engineering breakdown, whereas a lot of Agile organizations will break down and classify their structure of Agile teams based on the user's journey. And then you kind of like break those down into as small pieces as you can until you get back to that as kind of like two pizza teams. But I would say the most important thing is, once you kind of find one of these stories, it's really building a community. It's really, you have to get you have to get everyone on board and know that this is a team effort. We're not going to just say like, you're not going to get your money from yourself, right? And just be able to go execute. So you have to get the FMers involved. You have to get the testers. You have to get the users. You have to get people up and down the chain. And really, within your organization, you need that kind of structure where multiple people are interfacing with multiple other functionals, and get them on board with a story, create that community, and then you can start moving forward and getting some speed in there. But you can't go at it by yourself is what I would say.
Oh, you're still muted, Alex.
You're muted.
There we go. Pardon me. That's very helpful. Thank you. So I think we've kind of, first of all, that's been fascinating and informative. I love this story about the Xbox, managing the periscopes. And I like the whole idea of the white team finding 70,000 bugs in a minute. I'm sure that's not exactly what you said.
70,000 over the program. But
yeah. So that's really fascinating, guys. I want to thank you so much for joining. It's been really informative to get a perspective. First of all, the historic perspective. We kind of started with Agile a long time ago without calling it Agile. Yeah. And then we went to waterfall, and now we're saying, well, maybe old is good. And we've got to go back and rethink about how we're doing those things. So I love that historic perspective. And I also like the case study of the Kessel Run and how that's turned into something that's really working well. So thank you both, gentlemen. Thank you very much. This has been really, really helpful and informative for me. And I invite you to stay along if you'd like to. And we're going to go to our next speaker in just a moment.
Thank you, Alex. Excellent.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. So I'd like to just give me a moment to organize my screen here. So I'd like to introduce Syed Hassan. He's the Acting Director of Innovation and Agile Procurement Directorate and Innovative Procurement Methodologies at the Division at Public Services and Procurement Canada. He managed the development and implementation of the Artificial Intelligence Source List and is currently managing the Professional Services Modernization Initiative. His work includes the development of Agile procurement and other initiatives related to innovation in procurement in the government. He's worked in PSBC's Office of Small and Medium Enterprises, and he has worked at the Department of National Defense. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce Syed.
Thank you very much, Alex. I just wanted to make sure that you can see the screen. I'm just sharing a slide presentation.
Yeah, I can see that.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, Alex. I think that the information I'll present to you over the course of the next few moments touches upon how we perceive Agile procurement within the cyberspace realm. And as you mentioned, Agile procurement it's nothing new. Rather, we are developing some tools, and we're kind of polishing off some of the approaches that we have undertaken in the past as well. So I hope you find the presentation to be informative in terms of the Government of Canada's experience in the Agile space. So as you mentioned, my name is Sid Hassan. I'm the Acting Director of the Innovation and Agile Procurement Directorate at Public Services and Procurement Canada. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to present to you today to provide you with a general overview of Agile procurement from the perspective of PSPC Acquisitions Program. I will guide you through our Agile procurement definition, principles, best practices, and key benefits of Agile procurement. I will also provide you with some insight through Agile procurement processes that were managed within the acquisitions program here within PSPC. PSPC Acquisitions Program is adapting its practices by applying Agile techniques to procurements when appropriate. Here we see the definition of Agile procurement developed through consultation by PSPC Acquisitions Branch. There are 4 key factors that should be present for a procurement to be considered Agile. Firstly, we have an iterative approach to deliverables, allowing for off-ramps and pivots using small, time-defined and iterative work packages with mechanisms built into the procurement to adjust or terminate if the project stops demonstrating value. Secondly, an outcomes-focused approach where the government states its requirements in a high-level manner, allowing for suppliers to propose a range of solutions. Thirdly, is the use of cross-functional teams throughout the procurement process. And fourthly is the collaboration with suppliers on needs and outcomes. A key benefit of Agile procurement is that it challenges us to approach procurement differently. It's a changing of the mindset while respecting the current legislative and policy framework with the objective to attain better procurement outcomes. To do this, we need to remain open-minded while also considering the market, the clients and user needs, their operating conditions, and their desired outcomes. Here we see the Agile procurement principles adopted by PSPC Acquisitions Branch. Some of you may notice that these procurement principles are based on the 12 principles behind the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. And some of the key principles here is the involvement of users throughout the process, focusing on early and frequent deliverables, and being open to new approaches. I won't go into every one of these elements in detail, but these are some of the elements that we have observed to be important and to respect within the Agile procurement space. Here we have our best practices for when contracting officers are working as part of an Agile team. These best practices are detailed. We have an internal site and internal documentation where we have these best practices detailed. But some of the key really important and imperative elements are creating a collaborative and cross-functional team where we have dedicated resources committed to the procurement exercise, establishing clear roles and responsibility. And very important also is an element of engaging early and also having constructive discussions with stakeholders throughout the process. PSPC and its clients can apply Agile procurement principles and best practices to any or all stages of a procurement process. The requirement definition phase provides the opportunity for us to engage early with stakeholders. So that would include procurement experts, clients, users, industry, and/or subject matter experts. We can also examine whether outcome-based specifications should be used and have discussions on whether the solicitation documents should allow for an Agile contract. A variety of procurement documents may be used during an Agile procurement process, such as a request for information, an RFI, an invitation to qualify, ITQ, calls for proposals, requests for proposals, and a review and refine requirements. Depending on the complexity and nature of the procurement, we could have several requests for information and invitation to qualify for the same procurement. For the evaluation phase, where appropriate, the Agile procurement team can consider making use of the phase bid compliant process, multifunctional evaluation teams, and demos or presentations from bidders. There are various ways to create an Agile contract that we have seen internally, And two examples are a multi-phased contract with a bake-off. And this is where contracts are awarded to multiple suppliers to develop a preliminary solution. It could be a pilot or a proof of concept or a prototype. And then the contract with the best preliminary solution can be amended to add the development and delivery of a production-ready solution. Also, task authorizations can be used if some or all of the work under the contract will be performed on an as and when requested basis. It is possible to issue task authorization or TAs in a competitive manner if contracts will be awarded to multiple contractors. As part of the closeout phase, Canada may wish to obtain feedback from stakeholders, including users and suppliers. For example, for one particular procurement process, a request for information was posted after no responsive bids were received to invite feedback from suppliers through a questionnaire, one-on-one meetings, or an industry day. This feedback was then used to create lessons learned for future procurements. And also throughout the procurement process, we have the ability to use technology to assist with engagements and to host interactive webinars and also to host online questionnaires. Here we have some myths and facts about Agile procurement. In our organization, we try to communicate that, the first myth is that Agile is fast. And the reality is that using an Agile methodology can be fast, but it does not necessarily mean that a client will get their deliverables faster. Rather being agile will help the team learn faster through iteration and experimentation. So for instance, draft documents are sent to the industry sooner in the procurement process. This permits industry to provide feedback, allowing Canada to reassess and adjust its requirements and its procurement approach and strategy. This helps reduce risks, reduce the likelihood of having to redo unsuccessful procurements, and increase the chances for success. Myth number 2 is that Agile removes the need to plan. And the reality is that planning is still essential. In fact, because of the iterative nature of Agile, planning needs to be done regularly and frequently instead of just at the beginning of the exercise. Myth number 3 states that Agile removes risk. We would rather say that Agile allows for more effective risk management throughout the project. Every project and procurement involves risk, but using an Agile approach helps you manage the risks more effectively throughout the procurement process by using an iterative, incremental approach, allowing for course correction throughout the project. And myth number 4 is Agile prevents failure. Instead, Agile incorporates failure, where you have more incremental deliverables that are time-defined. This means failing and course correcting sooner so that we can increase the probability for success. Also, with Agile procurement, we really need to change our mindset to one where we accept failure and risk, and we document and share lessons learned so that we don't keep repeating the same errors and the same mistakes moving forward. Generally, Agile procurement increases the probability of having a successful procurement because it is built upon principles of taking small, iterative steps and adjusting quickly as risks arise. However, there are also some additional risks and challenges that we have seen, including lack of capacity within organizations, the need for training and development in Agile and the mindset, more proactive contract management being required, and a potential blurring of the lines of responsibility between the Crown and suppliers. Now, every procurement is certainly unique and different. It has its own set of circumstances and characteristics. Given that, here we have the key benefits of Agile procurement. So from a high level, Agile procurement tends to involve ongoing engagements with stakeholders throughout the procurement process. And we have seen that this leads to more collaborative relationships with industry and higher user buy-in. Also, Agile procurement can involve outcome-based specifications, which are less specific and provide more flexibility for contractor proposed solutions. And it is also important to remember traditional procurement still has its place under stable markets and with defined products and services. So for the next few slides, I'll take you through 3 Agile procurement processes that were handled within our sector. And we will look at how they were different from traditional procurements, as well as the results and some of the lessons learned. The first one is the next gen HR and pay solution. This is a very complex project run by another directorate. It involves multiple stakeholders and systems. So there were many engagements were held with industry, users, unions, and other organizations. An industry day was held at the beginning of the procurement process, and this helped Canada learn more about what was in the market, what was available in the markets in terms of cost solutions. At this industry day, Canada explained that it was going to proceed with a procurement process that was different, using gates or phases to ensure that verification and testing were done before making a commitment to buy. HR Next Gen and Pay had 3 gates, with 2 ITQs or invitation to qualifies, followed by an RFP, a request for proposal. For the ITQ under Gate 1, bidders were assessed against 13 mandatory criteria. 7 bids were received, 5 were responsive. ITQ Gate 2 consisted of 67 rated subjective criteria. TBS made a call, TBS, the Treasury Board Secretariat, made a call across Canada, and public servants were involved in the process and provided input, from Coast Guard employees who work on boats to correctional services staff who work shifts. There were 5 responsive bidders, with the top 3 recommended to move to Gate 3. No financial information had been provided up to this point. For Gate 3, the RFP was sent to the top 3 bidders with the intent of selecting up to 3 bidders with their pricing catalogs. The evaluation was done against additional mandatory criteria. The 3 vendors also had to agree to generic terms and conditions. The process resulted in all 3 companies being awarded contracts, with further competitions occurring via a task authorization bid request process. This gives Canada the option to consider the other 2 companies if a contractor does not deliver under a task authorization. Task authorizations contain key decision points where tasks may be extended or refined or work stopped to meet the business needs. For example, a task authorization can be issued for work on a pilot and then extended for implementation and the run phase. This procurement had a compressed timeline, with a first meeting held in August of 2018. And the 3 contracts were in place less than 1 year later in June 2019. We now have contracts with task authorizations in place with 3 vendors, with a minimum work guarantee as well. Industry has been pleasantly surprised with the pace and openness of the process, and so far this procurement is progressing well. This Agile procurement process allows Canada to assess contractor performance and solution outcomes in defined, manageable steps or gates, receive and choose the best outcomes, allow project money to be spent more diligently, and mitigate the risks and impacts of project failure. For this next procurement, PSPC supported Transport Canada for a geographic information system to enhance maritime situational awareness in 10 selected coastal communities with Indigenous populations. So initially, Transport Canada was running this procurement on their own behalf, with 4 of their employees co-located at PSPC premises so that PSPC could support them in developing the RFI, request for information. This way, when some contract delegation issues arose, PSPC was able to take over the procurement seamlessly because of their initial involvement. And this illustrates how principles of early engagement, collaboration, and multifunctional teams can help our procurement run more smoothly. So how was this procurement different from a traditional procurement? So in this procurement, it involved collaboration with multiple stakeholders, including Transport Canada, the Canadian Coast Guard, Fisheries, Environment, the space agency, indigenous communities, provincial governments, non-governmental organizations, and of course, industry. There were 3 phases for evaluation and assessment. Under phase 1, bidders were evaluated to determine if they had the required experience and expertise to develop their solutions into a more robust and user-driven tool. The intention was to award contracts to up to 5 suppliers to build prototypes. The phase 1 evaluation resulted in contracts being awarded to 4 suppliers, with each contract being up to $100,000 each, and with 2 months to build their prototypes. At the end of phase 2, the 4 interim contractors had to undergo an evaluation by Canada of their prototypes, with 3 of those contractors moving on to the next phase. Given the importance of advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, PSPC and Transport Canada really wanted to involve Indigenous users in the assessment of the pilot solutions. So the Indigenous communities tested the pilot solutions and provided their input. During the 3rd phase, the 3 remaining contractors had to demonstrate their proposed solutions to the Government of Canada and representatives from each of the 10 Indigenous coastal communities. The sum of the points achieved from phase 2 and 3 determined the final technical score. So as a result, 1 contractor was selected through a contract amendment to develop, host, and maintain the system. The work under the contract was also delivered in an agile manner in that the contract completed the work in sprints and in close collaboration with the client and PSPC. We're happy to report the procurement was a success. Canada received a number of positive comments from the Indigenous communities on how the contract has been a success for them. However, in terms of lessons learned, we've learned that although the end users were included in the conversation from the beginning, PSPC procurement staff was not included from the initiation or from the beginning. So one of the lessons learned here is that we could have had better collaboration throughout the process. With the exponential advancement of artificial intelligence technology, Canada recognized the need and opportunity to create an innovative method of supply to pre-qualify suppliers for AI products, services, and solutions. Early and continuous engagements have been a key factor for this method of supply and the individual AI requirements. Requests for information, industry days, one-on-one supplier sessions, government conferences, social media, and various other tools have been used to promote interest and participation from industry, government, and partners. These engagements also increase Canada's understanding of the capability, viability, and commercial availability of AI solutions. Requests for proposals against the AI source list seek solutions to challenges, as well as solutions with more prescriptive specifications. Solutions are delivered in an iterative manner, similar to the Transport Canada procurement. That is, multiple contracts may be issued for prototype solutions. And then Canada assesses the prototypes and determines which contractors will have their contract amended for the next stage of work, which may include the delivery and implementation of the final solution. Currently, we have over 20 active Agile procurements in operation. And many of these, for the folks who may be interested, can visit our website at buyandsell.gc.ca, where we do have information on these. So thank you very much. We'd appreciate any feedback you may have, or any other tools or any other suggestions you may have. We'd like to work in a collaborative environment. So on the screen, you see our email address, tpsgc-tpwgsc.gc.ca. So please feel free to reach us at this email address should you have any additional questions or concerns. This brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope you found this information to be useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Syed. So that was really interesting, and it's interesting. I find how you can have a contract framework, and then you amend that contract as you move through the process. And so that's really beginning to align itself with an agile process. Question for you: when you adopt an agile process, do you have roles such as an owner, a scrum master, and so on? And if you do, where do those exist? Are those in PSPC, or are they in the client department?
So it really depends. We are actually in the process of developing additional tools that can help provide additional guidance to procurement officers, to users, to client departments. And I think that, essentially it depends on one procurement to the next. And things may be different from one to the next, but I think the most important element is to ensure we have the right mindset. We recognize the importance of having a cross-functional team, and we have the right leadership, and we have the right individuals involved. So we may have folks from legal, folks from our procurement at PSPC, where we play more of a centralized role. We may have folks from procurement on the client side. We may have leadership from PSPC and procurement, and also senior management on the client side, in order to ensure that when we are moving through the process, if key decisions are to be made, if we are looking at evaluating pilots, that we have the right people around the room to make those decisions. So, I mean, it's a very good question, but I mean, it's not one size fits all. It really depends on the procurement that we're looking at.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, I want to thank you very much. It's really interesting to see how the government is moving forward through your leadership in moving towards Agile and making it more responsive. So thank you again. That was a really interesting presentation. I'd like to now welcome everyone to take a 15-minute break, and we will be back here at 10:15.
Welcome back, everyone, and we hope that you enjoyed our first panel. It's important that we set the context, I guess, when we talk about agile procurement and cyber. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. We will now start the second part of our conference, and that is a panel discussion. With us today, we are very fortunate to have representatives of the Government of Canada, represented by Shared Services Canada, as well as the RCMP. In addition to that, we'll have representation from CCTX as well as Bell Canada. I just want to take a moment to introduce our guest panelists. Chris Goran is from Shared Services Canada, and he is the Director of Infrastructure Security, Planning, and Capability Development at Shared Services. So welcome, Chris. Gary Cooper is a Cybersecurity Procurement Specialist with Shared Services Canada. Welcome, Gary. Jen O'Donoghue is the RCMP's Chief Financial Officer, and we're very privileged to have her this morning. So welcome, Jen, to the panel. Bob Gordon is the Executive Director of the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, and Bob is a returning member of our panel from last year's cyber event. So Bob, it's great to have you back in our second year now on this topic. And lastly, from Bell Canada, Vice President of Bell for Corporate Security and Responsibility, Mark Duchesne. So Mark, welcome. We really appreciate a telecommunications perspective on this panel. And with that, I will pass the floor over to Alex McPhail to begin the second part. Alex.
Thank you, everyone. So thank you, panelists. And I'd like to, let's start with Chris Goran. I'm wondering if you can provide an introduction, about 10 minutes, on your take on how Shared Services views Agile procurement.
Yeah, I'd be pleased to, Alex, and thank you, Goran, for setting this up and the invitation to participate. Alex for setting the stage early on. Eric and John, that was a great history lesson, and really helped frame where we're going, and save for laying out a new and flexible process that PSPC is embarking on. I found it interesting that government employees have been invited to speak on Agile, and more specifically an engineer to speak on procurement. If you know any Agile glaciers, they might be better suited to participate. But all joking aside, I did bring my partner in crime, Gary Cooper, with me. So I'll lay out a bit of an introduction, and then I'll pass it over to Gary to bring things home. I just want to start by saying we're not doing software development. We're doing the procurement of cyber and IT security solutions at the enterprise level for the government of Canada. So we're looking to develop a solution that will allow us to meet the crossroads of where agility and velocity meet. So a little history lesson of my own. So I've been at shared services for about almost 8 years now, and in cybersecurity for the better part of 5 of that. And so I've seen a bunch of iterations and cycles of projects and procurements. After what we would consider not an overly successful procurement run with a bunch of projects for 2016, we produced a lessons learned document. It focused on everything from project management to governance to procurement. But what came out of it was a decision for Gary and I to tackle procurement first. And those lessons learned around procurement were specifically the documentation produced by the project sponsor and the technical leads under the project sponsor was inconsistent. There were long procurement timelines, and this has been outlaid previously when discussing the whole waterfall process. We had a lack of meaningful engagement and collaboration through the process with industry. And I had to admit that, we don't have, as the government, we don't have the market cornered on good ideas. The other point was the technical requirements in this traditional process were overly prescribed and led to constrained solutions. And in some cases, we had to recompete due to a lack of qualified respondents. So this all led us down the road of needing to work towards an outcomes-based procurement, which Syed talked about. That's use case driven and doesn't limit the industry's ability to innovate. So when I distilled all of that down, it was basically, we work in cyber and IT security. Our adversaries aren't going to wait for the government glacier to move and apply for budget, raise a project, receive approval to spend, and then spend 2 years on procurement before we finally start to implement. And that was the crux of the issue. So that's when Gary and I put our heads together and started to develop the concept of the cybersecurity procurement vehicle. So we went in knowing that procurement alone wasn't going to be able to fix all of our problems. That was clear, especially when governance from a government perspective is such a huge part of procurement. But we needed to start somewhere. So our goals when we set out were to create a secure collaborative ecosystem that didn't necessitate all of our procurements being publicly available on buy and sell, and focus on collaboration to improve outcomes. We wanted to incentivize meaningful feedback from industry. We also wanted to encourage greater competition. We wanted the small vendors to be able to have a seat at the table. Just like the government doesn't have the market cornered on good ideas, neither does the large OEMs and solution integrators within the industry. So, and then by breaking up the traditional process that used to be the request for proposals into various segments allowed us to be able to move a little bit quicker. One of the key benefits from me being on the sponsor side is the focus on technical superiority of the solution over financial as the differentiator in awarding contracts. True best value was to be the outcome but the financial evaluation would be the last differentiator as opposed to the predominant differentiator through a normal RFP process. The ability to have contracts in capability areas that can be refreshed based on technological evolution and ensure obsolescence isn't a factor. And that goes back to some of the points that were raised by the previous presenters as well. And then finally, and we're not there yet, but we're trying to decouple procurement from project governance. This is leading to an initiative that I've been pushing forward and has gotten a lot of traction within the GC, specifically with the Treasury Board and the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, who are our tripartite partners in developing and delivering IT security solutions, is the concept of managing things programmatically instead of in silos as projects. One of my guiding principles has really been to think big, start small, and act fast, but also be flexible. So that kind of guides where I want to go with the cybersecurity program. We've got really good work and partnership with procurement and vendor relations within SSC, and so I'm going to pass it over to Gary now to go into a little bit more on the specific side of the process that we're trying to manage and evolve. It's like anything, we need to evolve. We've learned lessons from the initial procurements, but I'll let Gary touch on those points.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. And I do apologize in advance. My puppy's just outside. She might bark and I'll have to take a 30-second break to let her in. But I do want to thank, obviously, Alex and Goran for the invite today. It's really exciting to talk about Agile procurement with a number of subject matter experts or subject matter enthusiasts, such as myself. I think both John and Syed and everyone in their opening intros, the definitions of Agile procurement and the way PSPC does Agile procurement, all these things were, for someone who works in this space, really great to hear. And I personally took a lot from that. So I appreciate all the other presentations so far. I think when Chris and I wanted to tackle the cybersecurity procurement, I don't want to say problem, but challenge, Chris did an excellent job in documenting what needed to change. Because I think if you don't have lessons learned and you don't have those pain points identified, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So when Chris as a client came to me, I wanted, as a procurement professional, to be able to design a procurement vehicle that was going to meet his needs. So Agile procurement, as was mentioned this morning, needs to be organic. And to us, everything was sort of happening all at the same time. The Prime Minister of Canada had requested the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, who was SSC's minister at the time, to modernize procurement. Procurement needed to be less burdensome, increase access, socioeconomic benefits. There was a number of objectives for Agile procurement and procurement modernization that the Prime Minister wanted to see. So we took those SSC marching orders to create the cybersecurity procurement vehicle. We were very fortunate to meet with the Next Gen Pay team and a number of the PSPC Agile procurement pilots that were mentioned this morning, and really hit the ground running and have some excellent collaborations with those people who were a little further ahead on their Agile journeys. So when we created the cybersecurity procurement vehicle, we wanted to have some similar gating type mechanisms to Next Gen Pay, because I think that by breaking up the procurement cycle, not just on the individual procurements themselves that Chris and I are working on now, but there was a whole bunch of upfront effort with creating, the vehicle itself and creating what Chris and I refer to as our secure supplier ecosystem. And these are vendors that have met mandatory requirements and rated requirements. They've gone through a vendor integrity check and they have cybersecurity experience. So we know who we're releasing our sensitive cybersecurity information to. This is very important because, as SSC's president mentioned at a recent parliamentary committee, cyber threat actors are real. There's 2 billion malicious activities that SSC and CSC intercept daily. anything we post on our architecture, our data center locations, all these things that could be on buy and sell could be exploited and used against us. So by creating that secure supplier ecosystem of pre-qualified vendors, 89 who we have to date, we go out to vendors who we know are secure and can see sensitive information. So when we created the vehicle, we went through 2 initial phases to create those 89. And now we're going through and launching security procurements to those secure vendors in an agile nature. So each procurement itself is agile. The definitions with ITQs and RFIs and all these things apply. We break up in iterative steps in doing our individual procurements. And we're really trying to focus on learning through each step. You know, we're entering our second year, well, our third year. We've completed 2 years. We launched in May 2019. And the first 6 months or so was creating the ecosystem and then launching into the procurements. So we've learned a great deal during that time. And we're now really starting to hit our stride and adapt our procurements as we go. Because I think, as Chris mentioned, the lessons learned are there. You know, governance isn't going away, but we can control our controllables and really improve our procurement processes, talk to industry and be innovative, but really have to focus on being collaborative as we were when we created the vehicle. You know, we did a year's worth of industry engagement. We launched an RFI in July 2018. You know, we had industry consultations. We had a whole bunch of information with creating the vehicle that really helped, you know, have that success that we've had to date. But we're obviously not satisfied, because I think the myths about Agile, which were mentioned this morning, that was excellent, because it's not necessarily faster. It doesn't mean you're not going to fail. You know, we have to constantly try and improve our procurements so that, you know, people like Chris and different cybersecurity stakeholders can keep Canada's national security interests and systems secure, because that's the ultimate end state, and procurement needs to enable that. It's tough sometimes to tell your clients no because of trade agreements and policies and things like that. But my job is to work with our legal counsel, work with industry, and have fair, open, and transparent procurements that ultimately are going to enable, you know, Canada's cybersecurity posture to improve and protect all those key assets. So I think from my perspective and the Agile procurement journey that, you know, Chris and I are on, you know, we've got 3 years basically under our belt. We're learning. We're working closely with many key internal stakeholders, but the external side and talking to industry and having that collaboration has been great to date, but I think it could be better. And I think that we really need industry buy-in in going on some of these agile procurement methodologies, because, you know, you have to be willing to accept subjectivity or more of it than in the past. It's not going to be black and white like some of these traditional RFPs with 300 mandatory requirements. You know, and we have a number of subject matter experts from CSE, TBS, you know, SSC, and other key stakeholders that are going to evaluate solutions in either a proof of solution or other maybe more subjective criteria. We need industry to accept that those people's opinions and our evaluation decisions, you know, are fair, open, and transparent. You might not like the outcome, and no one likes to lose. And I think part of the reason that we've structured our procurement cycles the way we have into chunks along the way is you're not spending a huge level of effort on one massive RFP. You know, we're progressively shortlisting, we're releasing mandatory and rated requirements as we go, so that final proof of solution and then financial evaluation, you know, you've moved all the way through the process, and there's no real, you know, window shopping or sort of sticking in there if you're not really compliant and can really have a strong solution for Canada. So we need everyone to understand that, you know, if we're going to do things differently, it goes both ways, right? We need industry to give us their feedback. We share drafts of our requirements. We share drafts of our methodologies. But when we execute on those, you know, you can't throw a stick in the spokes and complain because you lost on a proof of solution. You know, it is what it is. Canada is going to have subject matter experts. We're going to have the best and most repeatable and fair and open processes that we can, but we are going to have to move the dial a little bit towards outcomes and really defending our evaluation decisions based on, experts that Canada has in the field in the cybersecurity space. So Chris and I are trying to continue to move the needle. It hasn't been easy because, there's been a whole bunch of professionals in Government of Canada and in cybersecurity specifically who are used to writing 300 mandatory requirements, right? So there's a learning and training exercise in them getting onto the Agile train, because it's as I said, it's still new to government. It's not new, obviously, as a concept, but we're trying to teach our technical authorities on how to write a really strong testable use case versus defining a whole bunch of things that a cybersecurity firewall must do. So that's sort of our journey. I know I hit on a bunch of key concepts, and I know we're going to have some panels and Q&As and things like that. But I think that sort of hits on, from a procurement perspective, how my end goal is to support Chris in everything he's trying to do, and we're really happy that the Agile construct and methodology all started to happen at the same time that Chris was documenting lesson learned and challenges with what he was doing, what he was seeing, from a program and security project perspective. It all happened at the right time, and we're happy that 3 years in, we're continuing to improve.
Okay, well, thank you, Gary. I hope your puppy's okay. So that was really interesting, and in fact, I wasn't aware of just how detailed and evolved some of the Agile processes were inside of the government, and so I really appreciate that from both Chris and Gary. So just in the interest of keeping things on track, I'd like to move straight into our next presenter, Bob Gordon from the CCTX. Go ahead, Bob.
Good morning, Alex, and thank you for inviting me back to year two. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from what we've been talking about, and not focusing on procurement per se, but talk a little bit more about the cyberspace piece of it, talk about the threat environment that we're now all working in and facing, and we're having to do Agile procurement in. I was struck by a comment that John Scott made in his presentation earlier this morning, where he talked about having attackers probe your system over time can be helpful. It provides some very positive feedback that you can use. Well, let me tell you, we're going to have a lot of opportunity for that to actually take place. You see it almost every day in the headlines. Another organization has been breached by a cyber attacker. Reporting coming from Stats Canada last year, they did an excellent survey, probably one of the best in the world, on looking at cybercrime in Canada. And they said that 21% of all Canadian businesses had reported being infected by a cyber breach. And then last year, the conference board, they did a study to see what was the impact of the COVID relative to cyber attacks coming through. And they found that 28% of Canadian businesses reported an increase in cyber attacks through that environment. And those are astonishing numbers. So when you're walking down the street, picture that almost every third building or office group that you walk by, they've been subject to a cyber attack. Now, a lot of these attacks are targeted. They want to specifically go after you. They're looking for something that you've got. But a lot of them are also opportunistic. They're going after you because they did a scan on the internet and found that you're actually there, that you exist. You've got a presence on the internet. And the attackers are getting really good at adapting and taking advantages of new opportunities and things that are going on in the environment. I'll give you a good example. So when the federal government last year came out with some COVID subsidy programs, it wasn't too many days before the cyber attackers were using that narrative as part of the phishing email attacks that they were running against your employees. What they're trying to do is to play against some of that human emotion, the frailties we've got on things like when COVID was hitting all of us and going after it. So it's now a lucrative environment for them. When you look at cyber crime, it's now become big business. They run it as a service, so you can get ransomware as a service in the same way you would provide some other products. So if you're not a particularly sophisticated attacker, you can actually go and buy that expertise from someone. And their techniques are rapidly evolving. They're being able to bring on new attack techniques almost as fast as the defenders can actually bring on some defensive mechanisms. And we're now starting to see nation states both allowing cyber criminals to operate inside their domain. And they're doing that primarily because at times the nation states want to use those cyber attackers to go out and do exploits or attacks on their behalf and have that notion of plausible deniability. No, that wasn't us that did that. That was cyber criminals. We're not involved in that. And we see that playing out time and time again in the media when some attacks occurred. And some of these attacks that are coming on are very stealthy. And I'm thinking back of the SolarWinds attack that occurred last year. That's a good example of where Russia took a long time to go through. They were very stealthy. They went out and infected a lot of areas, but they only actually went after a very small number of ultimate targets. 18,000 customers of SolarWinds were actually involved in the process, but the actual targeting for exfiltration of data was down to 6 US government departments and about 100 organizations is the best we can see. Some other countries aren't quite so sophisticated or worried about being caught. I'm thinking of China that tends to use what we call a vacuum cleaner approach. They'll literally go out and hit everybody everywhere and just scoop everything back and do that later. And I'm thinking a good example of that would have been the Microsoft Exchange attacks that you would have read about over the last couple of months. The problem is that cybercrime pays, and the likelihood of them getting caught is pretty small. And so what we're now starting to see, and some interesting reporting coming out of Europe, but it's replicated everywhere, and that's that almost all traditional crime is now having a cyber element to it. And what's happened out of this is the nature of the attacks have changed such that you no longer have to just have trade secrets that they want to steal. If you've got something that's of value to you, it's worthwhile for somebody attacking you or to deny you access to that. The assumption has got to be that you're now going to be a victim, and everyone is falling into that position. And you think of some of the ransomware attacks that are going on now. It used to be they would come in and just encrypt your data. Now what they're doing is stealing your data. They encrypt it. They also steal some of it, and they actually put it up for sale on the dark web with the idea what they want to do is increase pressure on you to pay. And the payment now in Canada last year, the average cost of a ransomware attack is the ransomware just itself is about $233,000. That's a lot of money for small companies. And it's also become not just an issue for the IT department. This is now an operational technology challenge where the attacks can actually get in and disrupt your ability to operate. And I think the Colonial Pipeline shutdown that's occurring right now is probably an excellent example of how that's actually playing out in real time. Now, what does all this mean for the defense industry? You are a really attractive target. You're an attractive target for cyber criminals that are interested in doing ransomware attacks on you. They want to destroy your reputation. And certainly nation states are going to come after you for espionage activity. They want to get access to the information you've got, hoping that you've got either some secret information in there or perhaps just a better understanding of what the government's doing. The other challenge is that you're only as strong as your weakest link. So that sub-supplier that provides parts, services, or goods into you, that becomes your availability point. And that's a new challenge for businesses to actually have to take on. And what all of this says is that we're now planning and responding in an environment that changes almost by the day. We're no longer planning for an attack that's going to occur, next year or the year after. The list of victims is actually growing every single day. Now, before everybody starts jumping out of our virtual windows, let me tell you a little bit of what the private sector is doing to try to level the playing field or hopefully tilt it into our favor. And I was struck by a comment that Eric Lofgren made early this morning, that he talked about building a community. Well, that's exactly what we're doing in Canada. We're finding that collaboration actually works. We can benefit from the experience of others. And quite frankly, no company can actually do this on their own. Some of the biggest companies in this country are working together because they all realize they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. They can't do this by themselves. They've got to be working together. It's a great way to reduce some of your costs because you can actually benefit from what other people are actually doing, what other folks are doing. And you get really good information to actually help you do some of that live time blocking and tackling of attackers as they're coming in the door. The interesting thing is we're now starting to see, and the encouraging thing is we're now starting to see this whole notion of collaboration and sharing. It's now becoming institutionalized. So you've got groups like, certainly this audience today is familiar with CADC. You know, they talked about the concept of sharing cyber threat information and sharing it across diverse sectors or diverse groups of people, where you can actually get some trusted action undertaken. In the United States, I had some comments about sort of they're moving into the Agile side this morning. One of the interesting things is they've brought out the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It's a mouthful. One of the interesting pieces in that, and there's 5 stages that companies are going to have to start to meet in terms of their cybersecurity and their maturity. The 3rd level of that includes an element where you've got to be participating in threat information sharing forums. So they're now starting to institutionalize and make it a requirement that you've got to get involved in the whole collaboration effort. And that fits nicely in with what both Gary and Chris were talking about. We've also got institutions in Canada, such as the investment funds organization, now starting to talk about, they've actually updated some guidelines that they've got to, organizations that fit within their purview actually have to be participating in trusted information sharing programs. The same thing for the investment industry. They're looking and talking about how information sharing has now become an essential tool for mitigating cyber threats. Scott Jones, who's the head of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, was speaking at a conference last week, and Scott was talking about the importance of sharing best practices. Of cybersecurity can only be obtained through collaboration. I think that was a good message for all of us. And so finally, what does all that mean in a Canadian context? The private sector has come together to create the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. 180 organizations are now participating in this, and it's an environment where companies can get together. We create a trust relationship. We talk about breaking down some of the collaboration between historical competitors. Well, competitors can actually sit around and talk about how do you increase the overall cyber resilience of the country. We get involved in activities such as sharing best practices, sharing ideas, and sharing threat information. All sizes of companies, all types of companies are participating in it. So when you talk about the supply chain, it's a way for the supply chain group of companies to get together to actually talk about that activity. We've now got participation from the federal government. They've been an active supporter of ours from the outset. They're active participants, and we're now looking at some government departments actually joining the CCTX over the next little while. And one of the real strong advantages out of this is a way for you to help, for participants, to help secure the cyber resiliencies of your customer and your supply chain. Because if they start to get impacted, eventually it's going to come back to hit you. And I like the discussion that was led by a couple of chief executive officers from some of Canada's largest companies. When we were talking about creating the CCTX, they talked about how cybersecurity should not be a competitive issue. We all have to operate from a basic understanding of what's the cyber threat environment we're working in, because we've got to keep that entire environment secure. But within that, we will certainly compete on the products, the cybersecurity products we deliver, but not that basic understanding. And that's what the CCTX is here to do. We're here to actually create that environment where companies can get together, where government can get together in a neutral way and talk about how do we work together, how do we collaborate together and create that community where everyone actually benefits from it. I think, Alex, at that point, I will stop my remarks and turn it back to you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Bob. We're going to move to Mark Duchesne from Bell Canada. Welcome, Mark.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep. That's very good. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I would just like to begin by thanking Goran, Alex, and everybody that's involved in organizing this event for the opportunity to speak here. I've learned a lot since this morning. I am not a procurement expert. I'm a cybersecurity practitioner and a risk practitioner. So a lot of this is super interesting, and I just love the history of all of this. And just fascinating how, we turn around in circles, and, we used to be able to do things a lot more agile, and now we can't, and we're trying to figure out how to do it. So just maybe before we start, just want to situate Bell Canada for those that do not know us very well. So we are the incumbent telecom provider. We're also a media TV broadcaster, and we own a number of divisions that provide internet, wireless, wireline communication services from coast to coast to coast across the entire country. So from that aspect, we are one of the country's largest critical infrastructure operators. What that means is that we obviously have built quite a depth in terms of cybersecurity, both from protecting our internal infrastructure and networks, and also offering managed security services to a number of organizations, companies, and governments. The reason why I sort of want to make that point is that when I think of agile procurement, before I sort of, go down the procurement route, for us, really the goal is really agile development and operations. And the goal of that is actually speed and accuracy. It's actually getting faster and getting better. That is our objective that is clearly laid out across the company as the principle and the concept and what we're trying to achieve. So I do agree that procurement, sort of the agile procurement is not necessarily faster, but the objective, which is, agile DevOps, that objective is to become faster in Bell's case, and actually to become better as well. So with that context, we at Bell are have a bit of a vantage point where we're sort of on both sides of the equation. Sometimes we are, the customer, and therefore we won't need to work with certain of our suppliers in an agile way to achieve our objectives. And sometimes we are the supplier, and we do work in, agile procurement models with a number of different organizations, including some government agencies. So with that, I just want to maybe talk a little bit more about how do we do things at Bell with regards to dealing with our suppliers. So given that we are a critical infrastructure and a little bit risk averse, as most telecom operators are, we typically do not like single sourcing. We like to have diversity in our suppliers. We like to have diversity in our network components. We like to have, different options so that, if we get a problem with one, whether it's a technology problem or whether it be a sourcing problem, such as those that we're seeing, during the pandemic, we have a plan B. So our foundation is really to always make sure that we have that diversity. The flip side of that is that we recognize that to be agile, we also have to have trusted partners. And I just want to overemphasize, Bob was using the word trust, when he was talking about the CCTX and the companies that are exchanging information to be better and faster. It's the same thing at Bell. So we, over time have defined, I'll say, small list of suppliers that we work with that are entirely trustworthy. And I'll give you an example, like within our network operations team, Cisco, VMware, Five, just to name a few, are companies that we trust entirely to the point that they are embedded into our DevOps cycles. And I was sort of listening to, how do we get faster? How do we get better? How do we set requirements and then make sure that we, get the right supplier or partner to be able to help us deliver it? Well, we actually think that if you do figure out how to get the right trusted partners around the table, it makes you a lot faster, because not only are they responding to requirements, but they're actually helping you design the requirements. They're helping you design the solution. They're helping you define what good will look like in the future. And we are seeing that obviously is making us better because it's giving us, or it's providing us, diversity of thought and leadership from that perspective. So in establishing that trust requires a great deal of investment and nurturing. So it's not an easy thing. I think everybody knows Agile is not easy to do. It's obviously a whole culture shift and a whole mindset shift. And it requires a lot of investment. So I think that's where, I'm echoing people's comment where they're saying it's not faster, it's not going to be easier. No, it's actually going to be harder. But when you look at the overall outcome, we think that if you can do it very well, and if you can establish that trust, then you are able to go a lot faster because you don't have to necessarily go out to the market for everything. Obviously you do for some things, but for some other things, guess what? You have a partner, they know you more than you know yourself, and therefore, a lot easier to move forward and deliver on the critical solutions that you need. So, this means that those trusted partners, we need to invest in them. We need to build relationships. It's not just, we're going to issue an RFI or an RFP and, see who responds. In the cases where we have decided to set up, trusted relationships, we are continuously investing in, the day-to-day exchanges, the making sure that they are tied to our operations, making sure that they understand exactly where we're going, they understand our strategy, they can question it, they can help make it better. So that actually costs. It's not cheap. It's actually a big investment in cost, but we think that investment, in those critical areas make us better over time. And so I think this is where our model is often flawed, is that we look at procurement and we look at the initial cost. We don't look at the full life cycle cost. So if you take, a solution or a service that you're going to procure, what is the full cost over a 20-year period? And nobody actually goes back and calculates that. To the point, I think that was one of the first points from Eric at the beginning, which is, we are not built and set up to be able to do that. So there needs to be a little bit of a leap of faith in the trust that you have, but also, a way to measure the true efficiency that you're getting out of certain of those relationships, which if you look at just the net, acquisition costs, you would say, well, maybe, they are 10, 15% more expensive than another provider. But, guess what? When you're having, significant issues or you have a big problem to resolve, having a trusted partner around the table will be worth, a lot more than the 10 or 15% basically cost increase that you've had to pay at the onset if you've built that relationship, obviously. So I'm not advocating for paying more. I'm just saying that to be agile, you have to set up the trusted relationships. You have to have the partners around the table, not just for the delivery, but even for the requirements and the design. And if you do that well, you still need to keep diversity within that group of trusted partners. But if you do that well, I think that you're more successful over time. We continued our journey at Bell. We, like any other organization, are focused on trying to be as agile as possible, to be as fast as possible and as good as possible. And we're not finished our journey. I would say that we're early on in our journey, even though we've been doing this for multiple years. So just to close off my remarks, I think that relationships are the key, are really the key to truly becoming agile in our procurement. And I think that the trust factor is at the center of it. So you have to balance that equilibrium between, making sure that you have diverse suppliers and sourcing methods, but also making sure that you have trusted partners that are there and that will be there when you're going to need them the most. So with that, I'm just going to transfer it back to Alex and
thanks,
answer
Mark.
any questions later. Thank you.
Fascinating. I really like the trust in suppliers and developing that as a community. Okay, so I think Jen O'Donoghue is now standing by, and I believe her audio is now working. So off to Jen of the RCMP. Thank you.
Hi there, and thanks so much for having me. And it's been a great session so far. I've learned lots, which is always why I like participating in these kinds of things. I'll bring us back to procurement. What I thought I'd do is share some perspectives from the client side of our procurement process. So as you know, I'm the CFO at RCMP. I was previously the CFO at Department of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard, and also had the procurement function at CBSA before that. So I've had the opportunity to go through several procurements as we have been going through this Agile journey with PSPC and SSC over the last few years. And I would say we've had lots of great successes, we've had lots of great learnings, and we still have some work to do. I think we've successfully brought in the collaborative component. That is working well. I think we've started to work towards outcome-based requirements. We're learning, we're moving towards that. And I think the next step, and as our previous speaker said, the next step for me as a client is to find ways to reduce that time to contract and really trying to find us as ways to get there quicker while still appropriately managing our risk. And I think that's where we get tripped up as we go through this process. So what I thought I'd do is share some learnings that we've certainly seen over the last few years. And I like the previous speaker's word journey, because I think that is what we're on, is a journey to get to that agility. And I think the first learning is collaboration works. We've had lots of examples of that, bringing in industry early, bringing them through successive processes, narrowing our requirements as we go is working well. And it's something that we need to continue to do, not necessarily for every procurement, because I do believe that some procurements don't need this kind of approach, but certainly our larger, more complex procurements are benefiting from that kind of an approach. It works well. It helps us get a better sense of what's out there. It helps industry get a better sense of what we're looking for. Second learning, I would say, is that outcomes are harder to define than we think. And through the processes that I've been through over the last few years, we start off with high-level outcomes. We're pretty confident about what our outcomes are. And then as our staff work through them, they've been trained to get us to detailed requirements. And our processes have really asked us to get to detailed requirements. As we go through funding decisions, governance processes, gating, all of the different pieces are really pushing us to get further and further defined in what our requirements are. And so we work through our collaborations, work very well. And in a lot of the ones I've been involved in, what we end up with is a really well consulted, very detailed RFP, where we have actually defined the requirements to a pretty significant extent by the time we get to procurement. And I think that's somewhere where we can continue to learn and evolve and try to push ourselves to get to outcomes as opposed to detailed requirements. And it'll take some work. And I think this is up to us as leaders in the procurement area to help our teams and to bring in new capabilities and new expertise to help us get there. Third learning is, I would say, assessing risk is a challenge. And we just heard around cyber threats, cybersecurity. I think we all carry scars. We've had different procurements go wrong. We've had security breaches. We've had incidents we go through. And there is a culture, especially in our security portfolio of security departments, to try and eliminate all risk from the procurement process. And we all know that's almost impossible, but we certainly try to do that. And that forces us to really get all of our requirements defined up front, because we're trying to think about every scenario and every possible piece. And that becomes a challenge for us. And I think we need to think about, how do we find new ways to mitigate our risk through the process? And we've heard about some innovations that are going on around modular contracts and early deployments. And those are the kinds of things I think we need to continue to explore and show that we can actually put mitigations in place and have off-ramps, have ways to change relationships over time that allow us to take a little bit more risk early so that we can enter into our contracts early and start working directly with the vendors. The fourth, and I think we've heard about this a lot today, is around building effective relationships. from my perspective, Agile procurement is about partnerships. It's about building partnerships through the procurement process and really thinking about our relationship with vendors differently as we enter into contracts. It's no longer a service provider. It really is a partner who's invested in the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think the more that we can do that and try and find ways to change the way we measure success and assess performance, we'll be better off to move through this. The last is, it's really about achieving results. So with this new Agile procurement, as I said, I think we're learning. We're getting used to working in different ways. We're getting used to partnering with SSC and with PSBC early on. I think we're learning how to get collaborative teams together early, and our teams are learning to work differently. And we need to, I think, now take a step back and look at some of the barriers that still exist that are stopping us from that, reducing our time to contract. And a lot of it is around our policies, our processes, how we're gating, how we're governing, how we're making decisions, and really flipping those to be more outcome-based and results-based. I'm optimistic we can get there. And I think it's these kinds of discussions that help us move the yardstick. We still have some work to do though. So I think the more we can share these experiences and continue to work together on these different initiatives, the better we will get. And I do think we will move to continue to get a faster time to contract as we continue to move through the process. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen. That concludes the opening remarks of our panel. And I'd like now to invite the audience to submit your questions for the panel. And we already have a few ready to go. So one has come in for Chris Warren. You said something, I think it was, you said, think big, start small, act fast. Can you give an example of a situation where you applied that concept of thinking big, start small, act fast?
Oh, geez. There's, I guess the biggest one for me is the development and pushing forward the programmatic approach with the cyber program. And go back to some of the pieces that Jen just iterated, and I was jotting notes down and realizing that we've been able to start achieving some of these things because we're thinking differently and we're trying to push the envelope. I think I said earlier, part of the nut that we have to crack here from a Government of Canada perspective is the way we govern our processes. The Minister of Digital Government has said in a couple of meetings internally that we need to break that culture. We can't deliver IT, let alone IT security. Maintaining the types of processes from a governance perspective we have, or it goes back to Eric's point, we risk obsolescence. So taking a programmatic approach and trying to break down silos has been effective. We're still working through the elements of it and building those relationships and partnerships so that we can take that systems of systems approach from enterprise solutions for the government and break down those barriers. So I think thinking big there is one of the pieces where it's been effectively working. But I think in my opening remarks, I also said that procurement isn't the only piece of it. So the program encompasses all of those elements around it. So we started small. We took a piece that we knew that we could tackle because it's really hard at my level to try and tackle the behemoth of Government of Canada governance without gaining that support both within SSC from the Deputy Minister on down, but also then reaching across to the strategic partners in in the government. So I would say that that's in a nutshell, thinking big, starting small, and acting fast. Now 2.5, 3 years to get to where we're at with the procurement process may not seem fast, but there's been a lot of effort. We've moved a lot of mountains to get to this point.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned breaking down barriers, and so that actually is a good segue into our next question for Bob Gordon, because you talked about how important it is to have cooperation and collaboration among competitors. So what's the environment that you're able to create to break down those barriers between natural competitors?
I think it comes down to two things. One is certainly executive leadership blessing the process. And we've talked about that in several of the conversations earlier today. So there's got to be an umbrella that comes along from the organization that says, this is a good thing to be doing, that there's an advantage to our corporation being involved in that. So that's the one part. So that hits the umbrella. The second thing is cybersecurity is a people business. The technology is just sort of sitting there, but this comes down to people. So what we're doing is trying to create environments where people can get together, competitors can get together and talk initially about things that are fairly neutral, where they're not worried about giving away a trade secret from my company or putting my company at risk. So they can talk about, general things like what are some of the general threats that they're seeing? What are the general problems that they're dealing with, and how can they be resolving it? And all of a sudden, people start to realize, hey, you and I can actually talk about something, we can be benefiting from it. So there's something that's beneficial to me as an individual. It benefits my organization as well. And slowly what happens is you start to get into that environment where you're starting to trust. Well, there's some pieces where you say, okay, I'm not going to give that away. But you start to create that environment where people start to realize I can trust Mark and Bob sitting down and talking about that, because we're talking about things that are neutral and we can go through. And slowly you start to build that up to the point where you then start to say, okay, I've got this a little more sensitive thing I want to share with you. I share that, I throw it over the proverbial fence to you. And so long as I don't read about it in the Globe and Mail the next morning, I'd say, okay, this is working really well. And you start to build it. You start to build that incremental approach. It takes time. It's taken us, several years to get groups together to do that. I think we're at that point where it's starting now to gel, and we're starting to see organizations now starting to take the lead where doesn't have to be the CCTX that does it. We sort of set the environment where we now start to get groups going off and starting to work together on projects where they can see some common good coming out of that process. I think that's what it comes down to. Corporate structure at the beginning, setting the tone, and then down to the individual level.
Okay, thanks. A question has come in for Mark Duchesne. You had an excellent discussion about developing trust with your suppliers. How long does it take to develop that kind of trusted relationship with your suppliers?
That's a good question. I guess it also depends on the supplier, but I would say that, in my experience, it takes probably at least 3 years to get into, an area where you've had enough experience, as Bob is describing for the CCTX. It's a little bit of a similar analogy, which is you need to experiment, you need to build the trust. And then at a certain point, you come to a point where, you are not, you're ready to invite a supplier in to help you design your solution. And so I would say 3 years by experience is sort of the starting point.
That really is a big investment.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Jen O'Donoghue. There was a lot of focus on reducing risk. And so I was wondering or the questioner was wondering if you could elaborate on how you seek to reduce risk through Agile procurement.
Yeah, so great question. And I would say it's a question that we've been discussing a lot with PSPC. And I think it's back to what Mark was just saying. It is about building trust with our supplier community. And as we build more trust and we build more trust in our processes, we can find ways to take a little bit of risk, understanding that we've mitigated it. And the more we can actually have smaller modular approaches to what we're doing and relationships that we can set up with the vendors on a longer term, I think the more we'll get there. The challenge is that we want to understand every single risk that's possible before we even start. And I don't think we can ever get there. So it's being thoughtful, being tolerant, and understanding how to mitigate as much as we can.
Okay, thank you. A pragmatic question for Gary Cooper. How does a vendor qualify for the secure supplier system?
That's a great question, and one that we're hoping to be able to better answer in the coming weeks. On buyandSell.gc.ca, the Government of Canada electronic tendering service, we've posted the ITQ there. 5 different submission deadlines to date. The last year has been very busy with Chris and myself, obviously working on the cybersecurity projects, and obviously working through a pandemic and being short on resources. So we haven't been able to reopen that qualification, but we're hoping to in the next couple of weeks or so. So keep an eye on buy and sell, and we hope to have more, to crack the 100 mark, to get more vendors and include more diversity in our ecosystem.
Thank you. I think the next question is not directed to any particular person, so I'll ask anyone to speak up on it. How do you build cost predictability when approaching an agile procurement? Anyone want to tackle that?
I'll go real quick on that one. Yeah, one of the problems, of course, is source lines of code and function points are all not great predictors in the software world, as we're finding out. And in the Agile approach, it does seem like the better way to go about it is to kind of cost development teams, and then kind of justify the number of development teams. And then you have your cost estimators pretty close to what's going on the ground, so you can see what the velocity is and how much you're actually delivering, and then connect those two, because again, a lot of these metrics are very contextual. You can't just use a work breakdown cost from some kind of hardware element and then use that as a predictive model for the future anymore. So it looks a lot more closer to the ground level, and more like using teams and predicting the number of teams that you need, rather than the number of requirements or source lines of codes that you will be using.
Okay, thank you. Another question I think could either go to Chris or Gary. Are you able to discuss or share with us initiatives that have been awarded and are in operation today?
Yeah, I can touch on a couple, given that they're sort of completed. I think one of the big ones that SSC is proud of for our support of the Canadian forces was there's a company out of Australia called With You With Me, and that was started by an Australian serviceman who was retiring from the armed forces and couldn't find a job when he was leaving. So he created this online training software platform where basically veterans, when they were leaving the forces in Australia, could be trained on cybersecurity, because many of the skills that cybersecurity threat hunters in different roles, pair very well with former military service. So that platform was highly successful across Australia. It went into the UK and the US, and through the cybersecurity procurement vehicle, one of our qualified vendors, Ernst & Young, submitted that with the Canadian Forces to Chris and myself. So we went out to our ecosystem. We tried to figure out what other similar platforms or software solutions were available to help the cyber workforce. I don't want to say problem, but challenge, because there's never enough skilled cybersecurity people. So we found With You With Me, with Ernst & Young, to help veterans transition to cybersecurity roles. We ran a competitive process, and that was awarded. And now we've, I can't remember the exact numbers, but we're almost 100 veterans have been hired across D&D and different spaces, and different groups have bought cybersecurity training for upskilling their not just veterans, but different resources. So that was a success story. We also did a simplified digital identity validation solution. SSC worked with ESDC to help secure the My Service Canada account, because the traditional mail out of a code to get into an ESDC My Service Canada account was problematic with COVID and different rapid registration responses that they were looking to get in place. So now they, I think last week they launched. The procurement effort was less than a year, which for procurement is fast. So we did that in an agile fashion. ESTC was great to work with, but it was a lot of work for myself and my team, because agile is more resource intensive, right? And that's where, you know, Chris and I and the messaging we've sent up to our senior management is we need more people, because agile procurement can be successful. We need more people, we need more lawyers, we need more resources to get to the outcomes that we foresee. So those are two that were success stories that come to mind. Chris and I, in some of the more larger complex enterprise procurements, we're hoping to have more successes in this upcoming year as we move through proof of solution phases that are coming up, and those financial evaluations and awards. So some Treasury Board submissions are pending for approval to award contracts, but I think 2021 is going to be a great year from our perspective.
Great. So if I think that's the questions that we have, no, that's it. That's all the questions that we have. So I'm going to thank the panel very much for your insight, your input, and your time. I've learned a lot here. I'm really happy to have been a part of this. And it's an important process, an important discussion to have. I think that everyone understands that agile procurement isn't something that you do overnight. It starts with a discussion, and it's my hope that among the panelists and among all of the viewers of this program have a better insight into understanding what are the kinds of questions that you need to ask, what are the factors that you need to consider. I like how one of the panelists just said, well, listen, you don't just go look for agile procurement. It has to be something that evolves organically and naturally. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank all of the organizers of this program, and I will pass it back to Goran Pesic to close the program.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your closing remarks. I would like to also thank our guest panelists and speakers for sharing their thoughtful and important perspectives on the issue of Canadian defense and security procurement, especially with respect to Agile. So thank you very much. You know, getting Agile procurement for cyber projects right, just on time and on budget, will represent a key challenge for government decision makers and political leaders. For industry, the opportunities for greater collaboration with government customers in new and innovative ways to deliver important and time-sensitive capabilities remains the ultimate goal for the purchasing of solutions based on the outcome required rather than the product or service specification. Today, we've started a very positive dialogue, and I encourage you to continue this conversation by visiting the EXA website at www.exaconsulting.group. We hope that we see you again at another EXA hosted event. I would like to thank and recognize my staff and associates at Samuel Associates here for their efforts and contribution to this conference. Alex, Katie, Jonas, Eleanor, Dave, Barbara, and Jerry, thank you very much. To learn more about Samuel Associates and how we support clients in the aerospace, defense, and cyber domains, you can visit us at samuel.associates. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for engaging us today. I'm Goran Pesic. I wish you farewell for now.